Thanks for the download. If you're enjoying the pod series, then please follow the Unconventional Soldier podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen. If you can, please leave a decent review and share it with a mate, and help us keep these stories of soldiering and history alive while supporting military voices that rarely get heard. Positive reviews and recommendations really help us bring it to the attention of new listeners. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram and LinkedIn, so we'd be grateful for follows over there too. And if you want to keep the mic on and the episodes flowing, head to the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. Every brew keeps us in the fight by lowering production costs, and many thanks to our recent contributors. Our guest today is former British Army officer Rob McAllister, who details his military career with a focus on his challenging early life with dyslexia and his eventual decision to join the Army, specifically the Royal Logistics Corps, after a period of academic and professional frustration. The conversation centres on his deployment to Afghanistan as a young lieutenant commanding combat logistic patrols, a role for which he received minimal preparation and was often responsible for large convoys of many vehicles and up to 120 soldiers, resupplying British operating bases. Rob recounts the evolution of threats from direct contacts to IEDs, the inadequacies of early equipment and vehicles, and the immense responsibility placed on young officers and NCOs. He concludes with reflections on leadership, risk management, and the crucial importance of cultural awareness gained from his experiences. Let's crack on.
So, Rob, welcome. And as always, can you please give us a quick overview of your military career, why the British Army, and why the RLC?
Yeah, thanks, Kev. Yeah, so I guess I sort of have to go right back to the beginning, like at school. I still struggle quite a lot with dyslexia. And so I was at school in the sort of 80s and 90s where I guess dyslexia wasn't really particularly well understood or catered for in mainstream education. So I went through the whole schooling system not necessarily being treated as you'd like to be treated by your teachers. And I sort of rebelled against authority, I guess, when I was at school, like certainly in my early teens, had some real struggles there. But I guess my one saving grace was really like I was pretty good at sport. So did a lot of rowing at school and took that quite far and played quite a lot of rugby as well. When I was 13, I sort of transferred schools to a school that was called Pangbourne College. It's a naval school on top of a hill in Berkshire. And that was a lot more accepting of the whole person rather than just like, you've got to be good at academics. You know, they really sort of pushed you into doing like the extracurricular activities and sort of, you know, rewarded you for doing that. But then I sort of finished at school, you know, had a really good time at Pangbourne and then went to uni, did a business degree, sort of coasted through, really, again, struggled with the academic side of things. And when I came to applying for like grad schemes, like no one would touch me at all because my A-levels weren't great. My degree wasn't particularly great. And again, I was quite despondent with the whole system, the educational system, not really valuing those characteristics that you learn through doing sport, but are also like really applicable in any form of career. So that was sort of 2003 when I was going through that mill last year at uni. And then the Iraq war kicked off. And I looked at the tanks all building up in the desert in Kuwait and going across the berm. I thought, that looks a lot more fun than sitting behind a photocopier or, you know, making the brews on a grad scheme or something like that. So I started pursuing the army specifically to see what was on offer. It was the first organization which I really felt that I had a synergy with, that I felt actually wanted me rather than just flat out rejected me for not being able to spell properly on a test or something like that. So I think it felt like quite a natural fit. And looking back, I'd always had like quite a few family role models that had served. So my grandma was really into genealogy, and we've got the World War I diaries from some relatives that were in the trenches. One of them was like second lieutenant who was unfortunately killed. My grandfather was in the Paras in World War II. Other grandfather was a tail gunner in a Lancaster bomber. So I still had that connection with that wartime generation.
So, Rob, you got a good lineage there when did you go to Sandhurst then? How'd that come about?
Yeah, so 2006, I got offered the place at Sandhurst, and I don't know if they still do it, but you have to get sponsored by a regiment. I had that connection with the paras, so I went and did the potential officers course at the parachute regiment and passed. I was also looking at Royal Gloucestershire, Berkshire and Wiltshire regiment as well. So when I got to Sandhurst, I quickly found out that I didn't really feel that the infantry was the right fit for me, certainly not the paras. And that sort of left me without a cap badge to go to. And there were loads of infantry cuts. So a lot of people were transferring their young officers' position to the next intake or the intake after until the amalgamations had happened. So I started looking around and the RLC came up and I was thinking, you know what, they seem a good bunch. They were big on the sport, big on the adventurous training, which were two things that I really was keen on. And I also liked the variety that was on offer with the RLC. So you could go and do airborne, you could go and do commando, and you could do catering, you could do driving, you could do ammo tech, pioneers. It was so vast in terms of what you could do.
So you commissioned, Rob, and then you got into the regular army.
And so I remember distinctly we were coming up to the end of senior term at Sandhurst. You had to put your posting preferences in. I put down a regiment in Abingdon. I came back with 4 logistic support regiment. I think the form had operational deployments next door to it because everyone was going on ops at that time. So I sort of had a vague understanding that I'd be going to Afghanistan, but I didn't go direct from Sandhurst straight into my regiment. I had to do my specialist training. So I think it's about a 14-week course where you learn about being a logistician. And we spent 5 weeks up at the Defence School of Transport in Leconfield, getting all of our driving licences as well, which was a massive waste of taxpayers' money because officers are allowed to drive because probably crashed the vehicles. But anyway, I got my HGV licence and I use it to tow my camping trailer. And I think it was really interesting because a lot of the guys had done recent tours, but the course was very, very Cold War focused. It was sort of the forward echelon, the rear echelon, how you delivered supplies via distribution points to the QM's department of the infantry regiment, and then they took it forward. I distinctly remember we were supposed to have someone return from Afghanistan to talk about this new thing called a combat logistic patrol. They didn't turn up. So we just had like a free morning. So I think the only experience that I had through that training of even something vaguely near leading a convoy was a 5-vehicle packet on our final exercise in a snowy Germany. I then reported for duty at the regiment and met the OC of Rear Party, who I think was a little bit disgruntled with not having been selected to go on tour. I think he was getting out. Didn't seem like that particularly clued up on what was going on. And he was like, yeah, you're going to Afghanistan, collect your kit, you'll be on a plane in the next couple of days. So I went to the QM's department. They had absolutely no kit. So I think I deployed with like 2 sets of deserts. I think I had 1 pair of socks, one T-shirt. Yeah. So I quickly went down to the old army surplus store and bought as much hiking socks and things as I possibly could. And I had absolutely no reference point of what I should be taking. I packed as per the Sandhurst kit list. So I tucked up at Bryce. I had my smock on. I had my knife, fork, spoon. I had my compass on a little string. I had 2 bags of Haribo in the chest pockets. I'd been out on the beers the night before, so I was feeling a little bit shabby. But I landed in Afghanistan about 8 hours later, feeling a bit worse for wear. Basically dressed to go on Sandhurst.
I bet you were a troop sergeant standing there when you turned up.
But then I got put on the bus and taken down to the reception, staging and onward integration facility, which was this big tent. And I thought, well, so someone will come and meet me. And no one did for 2 days. So I was there just tipping around, no idea what I was doing. I was like, what should I be wearing? Should I have body armor on, helmet on? Anyway, I worked out where the squadron headquarters was, because there was a squadron based in Kandahar. And I was patrolling around as if I was on ops, as if I was on a Sandhurst exercise. I have a rifle, body armor, everyone's looking at me. Who's this dude just walking around in 50-degree heat like that in the middle of Kandahar? But then after a couple of days, someone found me and then said, Second Lieutenant McAllister, can you please get on this plane? I got on a Herc, flew down to Bastion, and then met the squadron. And that was interesting, because they'd been out in theatre for a month already. And I still needed to do a bit of PDT training, before you went out on the ground, live firing and just all the, I think it was called Op-Barmer, the old IED drills and everything like that, your 5 and 20s, before you're allowed out on the ground. And also the whole heat acclimatization. But on the convoy, when I was pretty much landing in theatre, one of the vehicles hit an IED and no one was killed, but the driver and the commander suffered life-changing injuries, basically. So you sort of got there and you were like, oh, yeah, this is pretty serious. And then suddenly I found myself shadowing my troop staff sergeant on, it was called an op loam. So those were the ones that went from Bastion up to Fob Robinson and onwards to Sangin and Jackie. So I found myself sat on basically a box of water on the back, in the back of a Pinsgauer, just doing top cover and watching what happens. Nothing kinetic happened on that op, but I think it was like a real eye-opener of meeting your soldiers on tour for the first time and trying desperately not to muck up, because you hadn't done any of that 18-month pre-deployment training with them. When we got back, it was pretty much me in the hot seat. The troop staff sergeant was like, yeah, right, sir, you crack on, you're in charge now.
We've been having a bit of a laugh to and fro here, Rob, about this. And I've talked to other officers about, it's hard enough for a young officer to turn up at a regiment and go on an exercise, but to turn up as you did and then go straight on operations, huge pressure. And a lot of self-induced pressure as well, no doubt, because you feel that doubt, You're just new out the factory. So even though we're not laughing at you, I'm just laughing at the situation the army threw you into, because that's just what the army does.
Yeah. Sink or swim, right?
and also, what everyone doesn't realise is 2006, 2007, the CLP concept was just being put together. And it was, I won't call it bodged, but it was finding as many vehicles that would fit a profile, Pinsgauers, Wimics if we had them, putting them around, slow lumbering, heavy goods vehicles, which is basically, once you leave the good roads of Bastion, you're on a cross-country route all the way up to Sangin, all the way to Kajaki, because it's not a road that we recognise in the UK. With all the challenges that come around that, like you were talking about Barma, so every time you get to a vulnerable point, you've got to do a drill. You are being followed, you are being dicked all the way along. There's a hell of a lot of pressure. And then in the early days, you didn't have the overwatch that perhaps later Herricks developed and were provided in the same way, like when Colin was over there, you had Hermes and all the rest of it that was providing overwatch, FOBs, and for key operations.
Yeah.
In the early days of CLPs, you were basically on your own.
Yeah.
Whatever
100%.
firepower you got. And I think, and we talked offline about this, about the RLC are not infantry. They're not trained to that same level as well. So actually, you got some very enthusiastic, extremely competent people, but they're not infantry. They're not tanky.
Yeah.
They're not trained to that same level. It's a different role. And yet you're expected to get out there and you're going to be in the fight, the same as everybody else.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you looked at the type of vehicles that we had, I mean, it was, some of them were falling apart. I go back to that Pinsgauer. My first command of that Pinsgauer, I wasn't sat on a box of water. I was sat on the seat in the front, which was a nice upgrade. But they'd basically welded some iron plate onto the side of it. And I looked underneath, and there was supposed to be an iron plate underneath my arse over the top of the wheel. and that had fallen off. So, yeah. So I was quite lucky that I didn't hit an IED, because I don't think I'd be here today if I was. You look at the guys and the vehicles and the firepower that one of those convoys had. I think every single drops vehicle had a GPMG. We had the WIMX as well. So you had force protection call signs that used to rove around the convoy. So you had 6 of those, and they would have 50 cals or GMGs, grenade machine guns, on top. And then you had the command vehicles, which was generally they're the Pinzgauers, but then they moved up to the Vectors. So again, like quite highly mobile, being able to like scoot around. And it was great because, as you say, it was a concept that was very much in its infancy. And the level of trust that was placed on my shoulders as someone in their early 20s by the chain of command was absolutely vast. I think my biggest convoy that I led was about 120 people as a second lieutenant, straight out of Sandhurst. The situations which we found ourselves in, I think you go back to that basic training. And for me, it was Sandhurst. And Sandhurst is a really hard course. And that flexibility that Sandhurst provides in you, but also that resilience.
There's an old saying that logistics are the ball and chain of armoured warfare, and you could probably apply that to everything. And it certainly was the case in Afghanistan. But what went into planning a combat resupply convoy to a remote patrol base, and how did you balance speed, safety, and mission success?
Yeah, there was loads of pre-planning. And I think the convoys would generally not just turned around in 48 hours or so. You would have a good rhythm to your convoys. So if you had 2 close support squadrons, that one would be out on the ground and then one would be back in Bastion. So you normally be out on the ground for up to a week, 10 days, whilst the other squadron was shaking down the vehicles and planning their next op. So there was always someone being resupplied. But in terms of the planning, obviously the intelligence picture, so there was a lot of analysis around areas that you would be going in, the potential routes that you'd be taking. Looking back 20 years ago, and now working in technology and seeing what I do, I can't believe the things that the engineers were doing on big patrol boards and big patrol traces and everything like that. Massive map of Afghanistan with all the areas of sand were coloured in, so no-go areas for vehicles, ID belts had all been gone there. Previous routes, you didn't start to create patterns. And all of that was deconflicted basically by knowledge. There wasn't really any digital means. There was no AI back there saying, go this way, go that way. So that was quite an eye-opener. Those basic military skills that I think are probably having to be relearned in places like Ukraine with the decentralized nature of dispersing the HQs because of the drone threat, jamming of comms, jamming of tech system. You can't jam a map.
But you could run an Afghan-style CLP in Ukraine. It would get wiped out.
No, it would get absolutely annihilated by drones. We were used as a bit of a taxi service as well, because obviously we had spare seats in the vehicle. So a lot of people would come back from their R&R and then get on the convoys and be taken back to their FOB, depending on where we were going. We used to have some of the smaller units used to attach vehicles to the convoys as well. We used to have A&A embedded with the convoys. We used to do a tabletop set of rock drills with the orders. And then we used to go out into the desert behind Camp Bastion and actually do all the rehearsal drills as well. Contact left, contact front, contact right, IED, all those types of stuff. So everyone was properly tuned in on what they needed to do. And that also included the attached people that we would be transporting. If it was private soldiers from the Anglians, they'd be expected to do the rock drills as well. And we balanced all the weapons, and then pretty much it was go time. My squadron basically normally did the loams up to the north, up to Fob Rob and Arnhem and Sangin. And we also then started doing them down south to Goresh. But for the loams, which were the really big, punchy convoys, we used to go to Fob Price, overnight at Fob Price, but then leave and go through Gereshk in the middle of the night. So we did that under cover of darkness, no lights, MBGs and all that type of stuff. And then we get the other side of Gereshk just at first light, and then we'd break off I think it was the 611, which was the big route in Afghanistan, and then we'd go into the desert and make our way up to the north that way. But I always had a joke with my staff sergeant, because every single INTSUM that we got back in Bastion always said, "Oh yeah, Mullah Omar has been seen in Gereshk," and he was like the leader of the Taliban, and he was this Osama bin Laden's best mate. He's driving a white Toyota Corolla, and I mean every single vehicle in Afghanistan is a white Toyota Corolla, and it was the same with the IED suicide bombers. You know, it was like, a suspected suicide bomber has been spotted driving a white Toyota Corolla. So you definitely had to take the INTSUMs with a pinch of salt. But yeah, that was the planning of it. And I think in terms of speed and safety, obviously the rehearsals mitigated some of that risk. You can never really mitigate all of the risk, but going through the civilian areas in dark mitigated some of that risk as well. Speed was a really interesting thing, because you can't really drive these big, heavy vehicles that fast, and the road surfaces are so bad that you'd probably be rolling vehicles if you did try and go too fast, or break them, or break the loads that they were carrying. So we had to balance that speed aspect, but also the need to get from A to B in a relatively decent time. And I think there was one loam that I did. I think it was my first command, but we had an IED strike that was really close to my unarmoured Pinsgauer, which wasn't particularly fun being in it. But we lost a WIMIC, and again, the guys in there were pretty badly hurt. In fact, we had another casualty on that convoy as well, where someone broke their leg just because they hit a bump too fast, and they were standing on top cover, and their leg just gave way. So we had like 2 incidents on one convoy, and I think it took us something like 28 hours to do 80k, which is basically walking pace. So, you know, if you'd have just walked there, you could have probably done it at the same pace. So, yeah, it was hard to maintain that speed with all the stuff that was going on at the same time, but also balance that risk. And also, you didn't really want to get stranded out in the desert in the middle of the night, because you'd have to leaguer up.
How many vehicles were a typical convoy, Rob?
Probably around 40 to 50. Yeah. So, you know, looking at two to 3 people per vehicle. So, yeah, up to 120 odd people per convoy. And I think in the latter stages, we started doing the runs up to Fob Arnhem. And those convoys got a lot smaller, a lot more agile, a lot faster. They were sort of, 10, 12 vehicles.
It's interesting you say about all those vehicles, that large convoy. You're probably looking at 120 odd soldiers. I mean, that's company plus in a lot of respects, and it's usually commanded by a major, and you as a second lieutenant. It's a hell of a lot of responsibility, as you said.
I often speak about this with my mates that did CLPs on subsequent Herricks, and also my friends that commanded convoys in Iraq. And they were like, I can't believe that you guys were trusted as second lieutenants to go out and do that. Because, I mean, one of my mates did the Telek in 2006, I think Telek 7 or so, where he was going to like Basra Palace. It was like a brigade operation to get that convoy into Basra Palace, do the resupply, and get them back out again. And he was just in charge of basically checking that the doors didn't fall open at the back of the convoy.
I mean, do you think that in Afghanistan, and my time in the army was coming to an end in Afghanistan, so my last posting was 2005 to 2007, and my regiment was sending batteries out. But from what I saw and talking to the other senior NCOs in my regiment, I think initially over that period there was probably a bit of complacency about responsibilities and, dare I say it, an underestimation of the enemy at times. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, and I think my chain of command were fantastic. My OC ended up being a major general. My CO ended up being a major general. loads of the officers that I served with have done full careers in the military and gone up, and I think the adjutant's now, brigadier or full colonel or something like that. So they were all brilliant operators. But I think because of the way that with officers, they get stuck behind a desk for a period of time when you're a major or half colonel, I think they've missed out on that Iraq. That's sort of like the few years of Iraq. So I think they were coming in. And again, it goes back to what I was saying on Troop Commander's course. It was convoys to the distribution point is a troop commander's role. So I think there was an element of that doctrinal nature of it was like, right, okay, this is how it works. But it did evolve towards the end, because I think I was over there for 7 months, and at the beginning of the tour, first sort of like 4 to 6 months, it was, the lieutenants were out there. But then towards the end of the tour, the majors were out there. And then you look at subsequent deployments after that, it was always an OC's command for a squadron move. And you look at the big run that 13 Air Assault did up to Kajaki Dam, that was a CO. And I think eventually it became like a convoy became a commanding officer's, a half colonel's command, which was really interesting as a dynamic. Huge amount of responsibility to place on the young shoulders of second lieutenant. But then, in the Second World War, right? Yeah, brigadiers that were 30. And I think often a peacetime army, you get like the level of responsibility sort of gets quashed. And I think I call it a peacetime army. We were a regular army going out and doing small wars, but we weren't fighting for national survival or anything like that. So I think you didn't necessarily get that super fast promotion rate that you would get if it was like a conscription army or a proper national war footing type army like the Second World War or the First World War. So,
Well, I think what we have to factor in 2006, though, the main effort was still Iraq.
Yeah.
And that was where, dare I say it, people were building their careers still. Afghanistan, because my tour in Afghanistan with the military was in 2004. And we were scattered. I was in the north. I was nowhere near Helmand. We were in the north. In very, very small teams, loads of responsibility, very vulnerable. But we treated Afghanistan very different to the Iraq campaign. 2006, we were starting to hit the peak of the Iraq piece from the 2003 invasion and war through to the supposedly recovery period. By 2006, we were full in to an insurgent conflict. Basically, you're still fighting the Iraqi army. Afghanistan, the insurgency was starting to build their capabilities, but we were still in those early days. And I think across the piece, lower graded ranks and platoons and all the rest of it had a lot more responsibility, because 2006 is when we had the platoon.
I also think, Kev, you look at the army now, I think the army at the time, not that they didn't take logistics seriously or those support services seriously, but what it did was it led to refocusing. Because if you were to go on Salisbury Plain or Cartwright Garrison now and see a logistics regiment training, they would have GPMGs now. They would have 50 cals. They would, They would be properly equipped for the role. And I think that was the one thing that Afghanistan brought out. Every soldier's like a soldier.
Because I think we had a Cold War mentality with regards to logistics and logistic convoys. Because like you were saying, Rob, in the old days, the logistic convoy would bring it up to the second line support. The quartermaster would take the food, water, rations, and ammunition and move it to the front, to the first echelon, and then it get moved on to the company or battery groups for the rest of it. I think what people fail to consider perhaps is we're moving these convoys across contested ground in the omnidirectional battlefield. We were given the responsibility, but I think throughout not just the RLC, but another CAP badges, we were not always as well trained as we should be for that environment.
Yeah.
Because the environment was difficult. The tactics were new. We were working in platoon or company houses more as well. So actually, when you go to the FOBs, they were a lot smaller than some of the more established ones towards the end of the campaign or before we handed over in 2014. And you didn't have the level of support. So we're quite sparse anyway.
Some Kev's just brought up there, Rob. raised a question in my mind. You've got these huge convoys and you're approaching a tiny fob. How did you offload the supplies and things like that? Did you have an RV outside and they'd come in on quads or something? How did that work?
Yeah, so normally we just drove straight in. So Fob Rob was a really big fob. It was just a massive sand pit. There weren't any proper buildings there. It was just Tesco Bastion around the side. So yeah, we used to just drive in, park, leaguer up, and then offload. And I think, again, a lot of the regiments that we delivered to didn't really understand what the guys had been through on those convoys. Like a lot of young guys and girls had been out there dealing with some pretty crazy situations, IEDs, contacts, stuff like that, for maybe 24 hours straight. They were absolutely chin-strapped by the end of it. And then I remember when I went up to Sangin. Sangin was a smaller fob, so we got up to Fob Rob. They said, right, we're basically running out of everything in Sangin. You need to take 5 vehicles up and do a resupply. And it was the first road move that had been done in 18 months into Sangin. And so basically got heads down for an hour or so, prep the vehicles, put the night vision goggles on, and there are a couple of Mastiffs that were attached to us, and they drove us into Sangin. I remember one RSM came out and was like, right, get your men out and unload the vehicles. I'm like, look, we've been on the go for 36 hours, mate. Get your blokes out of bed and do it for you. And you don't speak to an RSM like that as a second lieutenant, but I was absolutely on my knees. I was like, no, you guys.
How did he take that?
He wasn't that pleased. The major got involved, and I think he saw my side, and actually the major backed me, which was really good. And then we drove back through Sangin. So yeah, it was different. Horses for courses. Like Fob Arnhem was again, it was quite small, so we only took very small resupply runs into Fob Arnhem. And Goreshk was the same down south. That was much smaller moves because they were more. Well, Goreshk was the old. I think it was the old school or town centre, town hall type place. So yeah, you could only really fit 4 or 5 vehicles in there. But yeah, different for each one.
Sergeant majors can be very difficult.
You will.
But we're all angels now. The other part I think we need to highlight a lot more is that the RLC has got quite a mix of male and female, where there's been a lot of discussion about women on the front line, all the rest of it. But what they all forgot was the RLC had females operating in the combat logistics patrols alongside the males, and no one considered it because the CLP's movement was never considered front line.
Yeah.
Until later, when they realised that actually anyone who steps outside of a patrol base, a FOB, or wherever you're going to go, you are immediately under threat because you've been shadowed all the way across. They know you're coming because, like you say, it takes days to prepare a convoy. We have a lot of local employees working inside the camp, so the security was always going to be something's going to get out, that a CLP is going to happen shortly. The convoy is a big, massive target. I mean, I used to jump on the Danish one. And the thing about a Danish one, they had a tank, and we never got touched. Strangely enough, a Leopard 2 at the front was a massive distraction for anyone to say, I don't want to engage with it because we have got nothing that's going to knock a tank out. And I just jump on there to get a lift to Fob Price and to other places as well because I used to hitch lifts. I get one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation, and I think we had females across all of the ranks, right from sergeant down to the young private soldier, and they did a brilliant job. They were every bit as good as their sort of male counterparts. And we had them driving, we had them on top cover, and the conversation now about women on the front line, I know it's quite a contentious one in some circles, but from what I saw, the ladies that served with us were brilliant. Obviously, they all had to do the same fitness test. They all had to be fit to go out on the ground. And they just mucked in and did exactly the same as what their male counterparts would do. I think as well, we're not fighting that old school traditional war where there's a front line. And it's an asymmetric war you're in with the civilian population, and you hear all the stories about people getting themselves in hot water, especially in the Islamic culture, for using males to search females and all that type of stuff. So outside, we didn't engage too much with the local population because we didn't want to stop and be fixed. But, with the search teams, infantry on the ground, female medics, everything like that, there was such a role for the female soldier in that counterinsurgency war, in that asymmetric war, where you needed to engage with those females in the local population, both from intelligence gathering, because the females would speak to the women and they wouldn't speak to the men, right down to search and loads of
I think the army really ties itself in knots over this, because the sea change from when I joined and Kev joined in the mid-'80s and left in the late 2000s. When I joined up, you had the WRAC. If you were gay, you get booted out. And then when I left, all that had been moved. Yeah. I think the army just ties itself in knots. If they just say, there's a fitness, don't muck about a fitness standard. If you have a fitness standard, stick to it. And if people pass it, they pass it. It's when they start tinkering with things. And we're a society. The way I look at it, dig out. If you want to fight for your country, that's what equality is all about at the end of the day. Yeah. So, what were the biggest threats to convoys, and how do your team adapt tactics or procedures to deal with them?
Yeah, we had a real sea change on Herrick 6. Well, I guess when I got out there, it was a lot of the threat was just direct contacts. So the Taliban would want to go like toe-to-toe with you on the convoys, engage you with small arms, RPG, the occasional mortar, stuff like that. But actually, the convoys were so heavily armed that you'd probably rather take on an infantry patrol than you would 40 vehicles, each with a GPMG on top. And often there were additional resources that were available to you, fast air on call or Apache helicopters, stuff like that weren't too far away. We did get some contacts where we were engaged by the Taliban. I remember I wasn't on the ground at the time, but one of my guys was attached to another unit with some of the vehicles, and the Taliban shot his fuel tanker with an RPG, and luckily it was carrying diesel, which isn't that flammable, but the RPG didn't go off. So he just thought, oh, what was that bang? Someone's throwing a rock at me. Drove into the fob, and there's an RPG hanging out the side of the fuel tanker. So I was just, get out of the way.
Were they self-sealing, those fuel tankers?
I don't think so. It had a massive hole in the side. So yeah, it wasn't like the slime that you put in your bike tires or anything like that. Yeah,
I think story to tell your grandkids, isn't it?
But then I think it quite quickly switched to the IED threat. So I touched on rock drills before we deployed. We used to have the force protection call signs used to rove around. You had a few at the back marshalling the slower vehicles, a few in the middle making sure that it wasn't spitting up, and a few at the front combing the ground, doing all the BARMA, the ID checks across any junctions or any waddies. But then we had a couple of ID incidents, one of which I've talked about, which changed the dynamic of the convoys, because those lightly armoured WMICs that were driving around, if they sort of struck an IED, they're just a Land Rover basically, and we were losing so many Land Rovers at that time that they devised a Desert Snake. I think the commanding officer called it a Desert Snake, which I think is what pretty much continued with the combat logistic patrol. You always tried to get the heavy vehicles on the front, so it started to turn into the Mastiffs on the front. Instead of WMICs, you would have Mastiffs embedded within the convoy as your force protection call signs. Basically, you lessened your profile on the ground, which meant you only needed to really clear one route rather than potentially a load of WMICs get lost. So that changed in terms of its drills. I think as well, something for the better was, I think, Kev, you touched on it, and I think you said as well, Colin, about the complacency when we went out there. People were just cutting around in rag order, really. They'd seen the videos from like Herrick 6 and stuff like that with people, I don't know, a pair of budgie smugglers and a baseball cap on, giving it the root toot toot from Sangin. And I think everyone was like, what is this new dynamic? And everyone wanted to sort of look alley when they're out on the ground, you know, just body armor, no helmet, T-shirt. And I think as the threat increased, you know, that alley look quite quickly became very dangerous, because if you weren't wearing your helmet, if you weren't wearing your body armor properly, if you weren't wearing long sleeves, if you weren't wearing eye protection, you know, all that type of stuff, we had to really clamp down on it during the period of the time, because during the latter part of the convoy, because so many people were coming back with avoidable injuries when they were blown up by IEDs, like flash burns because they weren't wearing long sleeves, and, you know, losing eyes because they weren't wearing eye protection, that it became very evident that these bits of effectively PPE were there for a reason, and you needed to wear them. And I think looking to the latter convoys, I watched something on YouTube the other day about the last ever convoy going into Camp Bastion. And I mean, they just looked so professional and so well kitted out in comparison to what we were in 2000.
I think that's also the secret there, how they were kitted out. You left a couple of pair of Desert Combats and main stuff you purchased, but the lads and lasses towards the end, so probably, I don't know, 2010 onwards or whenever, we're getting a decent kit issue.
Yeah. And the vehicles as well. I mean, would you go and drive a 30-year-old vehicle across the desert in Morocco? You know, like, you're going to expect to break down, aren't you? And that's basically what we were asking the guys to do with their drops. You know, the vehicles didn't have any creature comforts at all, like no aircon or anything like that. They were absolutely knackered. We were always towing vehicles behind us because they were falling apart. And then they introduced the new MAN trucks, which were basically a modern truck, you know, and they had the ability to bolt on armor. They had the ability to bolt on those RPG protection cages. They had things like air conditioning in,
which reduces fatigue and tiredness and makes the soldiers more alert in itself, just because it's easier to drive, doesn't it?
Again, this is coming back to, because in the late 90s, we were doing the Bosnia campaigns with the Cold War kit. Early 2000, Iraq kicked off. We were still using the Cold War kit. I mean, I drove around Basra in an open top Land Rover with chicken wire, because the only thing I had to stop someone posting. So again, armoured vehicles was something that other people may have had. I dreamt of a snatch vehicle.
Christ, that's a nightmare, mate. That's not a dream.
I know it's a nightmare vehicle, but I dreamt that a snatch vehicle would offer me more coverage and protection than the what I was driving around in with nothing. Basically, in old body drama as well, the old body armor, old helmet, everything was 20 years out of date when we arrived in Iraq. When I went to Afghanistan, we had we had civilian armored vehicles, but they weren't armored. They were just 4x4s in the north. Yeah. We didn't even have Land Rovers. We just didn't have anything. We had to buy commercial vehicles. Yeah. And I think Herrick at the beginning, it was very much a shoestring, because all the money was still getting invested into Iraq. It was a shoestring. We'd already, let's say, 2002, the Afghan campaign was over in real terms. Yeah. Just we didn't invest in it. We carried on somewhere else. And so Herrick was done on very much a shoestring. Quick, make the tactics work. And that's what you did in 2006, 2007, made it work. And then later, the investment came in better equipment, much better PPE, better weapon systems. When you start looking at the PGSS balloons providing surveillance, the overwatch provided by UAVs, in comparison to how it was in the early days, it was a leap forward, massive leap forward.
And I think some of the procurement choices in that time frame as well were particularly woeful. I remember they finally banned my unarmoured Pinsgauer from going out of the camp. And they gave me a Vector, which was basically another Pinsgauer, but it was armoured, lightly armoured. It had aircon, but they hadn't upgraded the engine. So the wheels looked like that. And then when you started driving, they righted themselves. But you couldn't pull away with the aircon on because the engine was so weak and gutless. You're just thinking, who in their right mind has bought this vehicle and tested it? This is absolutely awful. Like, we couldn't take them out on half the routes we wanted to. Even the old trucks were beating these things up hills. They were so weak and gutless.
Somebody making a good money on a contract somewhere.
Something which did change as well was we got JTACs attached to every convoy towards the end of the tour as well. So if something did kick off, then we had access to all the fast air that was available, local fire support.
I mean, a massive morale boost for the people on the convoy, knowing they had that sort of capability on board with them.
Yeah, and I think when I was involved in that IED strike, we had the JTAC was in my vehicle, actually. And unbeknownst to me, he had called in a call of a show of force. So he had a US, I don't know, F-16, F-15, something like that. I was standing on the bonnet of the vehicle, directing the operations, and I had this spider sense on my left shoulder. And I looked behind me, and no joke, about 10 foot above the deck was this F-16. He was so close, I looked through the canopy and I could see the pilot's helmet, and literally our eyes locked and then over the top. We were absolutely annihilated by the jet wash. And then he just popped a load of smoke and chaff off over the hills and away he went.
Brilliant.
Pretty crazy.
Top Gun moment. And looking back then, Rob, what lessons from these operations have stayed with you, either about leadership, logistics, or operating in high-risk environments?
Yeah, so I think some of my post-military career, certainly the first 3 to 5 years, were in high-risk and high-challenging environments. And I think that the Afghanistan and the Iraq experiences have sort of taught me a lot about mental resilience. It's never going to be as bad as that IED strike that we had, where you're still, 10 hours away from getting to safety, and then someone tells you that you need to drive up to Sangin. Like, it's never going to be that bad. There's a lot that the army teaches you that can be really valuable to a civilian employer that isn't necessarily recognized by civilian industry, about planning, about logistics, having an understanding about what it takes to run an event. So there's a lot which I've been able to take and apply into my civilian career. But I think probably the big one is cultural awareness. I think in Afghanistan, we didn't do a massive amount of time with the locals just because that wasn't our role. But then I went and learned Arabic afterwards, after this tour, and then deployed to Iraq, which we'll talk about later on another episode, where I was embedded with the Iraqi army. And I think I look back at seeing how I worked with the Iraqis versus some of the experience which I had with the Afghan nationals at the ANA, Afghan National Army, or some of the locals that I met. And I think I could have been more effective in Afghanistan if I'd have had better cultural awareness training. And then when I left the military, I ended up working a lot of the time in Beirut, in the Middle East. I also spent a lot of time in northern India as well, two very different cultures. And I think that skill of being able to speak to people, which you get from the military, like speak to people from any walk of life, is a massive skill. But also that cultural awareness, understanding of being able to deal with people from different cultures and be like a good listener and not just be fixed on one way of thinking, I think is something which I've really taken forward into my post-military career. And I'd like to think used it to good effect. I did find, though, when I was in India particularly, because I've worked in Iraq and because I've been embedded with Iraq, I was quite used to people just sort of the Iraqis doing what I asked them to do. But in India, they didn't do what I asked them to do, maybe because I didn't have a gun and a load of blokes behind me. but yeah, so that was a flip side to the cultural awareness stuff. But it's the adaptability. And again, that adaptability that the military trains you to do is something which you can take forward.
It's interesting you mentioned about the cultural side, because it was recognised later on the heretics that cultural awareness is a force protection measure because of the mistakes that we were making. I'm hoping it hasn't been forgotten, because there's also been a gap between the end of Afghanistan and other campaigns we're involved in.
Every campaign, Kev, the British Army forgets. How many times does lack of cultural awareness in a place like Northern Ireland come up in the podcast we've done?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is definitely something I have tried to do when I was a civilian in defence. I was very much pro in for civilians going in operations, cultural awareness, using your interpreter as a cultural barometer.
Even between armies, I mean, Rob was going on about the less than smart look that the army had at one point in Afghanistan, but I remember an American general complaining to the British about the state of British soldiers, and that was down to the cultural piece there, because the Americans had very rigid uniform standards, and they would look at us and they weren't happy the way we looked. That was in a report in the papers that a American general complained about the state of British soldiers and some of the FOBs.
But that was because that was their part of their lessons learned from Vietnam, wasn't it?
He directly compared us to the army of Vietnam, the US experience.
Oh, it's interesting. I didn't know that.
Well, Rob, this is now part one. There will be a part two for the listener. And part two will be about Rob's experience in Iraq and post-military. But as always, as we finish an episode, we finish with our guests, Desert Island Dits. So, Rob, what is your favourite book?
So, yeah, I think the book I've had that's impacted me the most was Changing a Guard by Simon Akam. I read that, and it was so well written by someone that was a similar age to me, that was a journalist, but he'd done a gap year commission. So he's worked with a lot of people, or a lot of young officers that then went on and served in my generation of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I just love the way that he looks at dynamics that aren't necessarily covered in other military books, like the role of social media and all these Ali videos that came out. Everyone suddenly had like their own channel that they could make their war videos on and all that type of stuff, to some Linkin Park or Jay-Z or something like that. And how that drove a specific type of culture.
Not always the best, though.
Yeah, not the best, but he also overlays it with the metrics and the data that we use to define success, and looks at the honour system, for example, and goes, right, you're getting a VC or an MC is obviously, it's a hugely challenging thing to be awarded, but actually in those type of counterinsurgency conflicts, do we want to be, we're rewarding people for being super aggressive and taking the fight to the enemy and all that type of stuff, but no one gets rewarded for, I don't know, going and shaking loads of people's hands and building a school in a village. And I think they go into the whole procurement cycle, and also the way that, again, honours and awards, how people are rewarded at the senior level of the military and politics for ultimately strategic failure. Whereas like a guy or girl who has a negligent discharge, they get fined a month's pay. And then you look at the sort of scale of one person's getting a knighthood, one person's, getting loads of cash.
He points out that not one general was sacked for the debacles in Iraq or Afghanistan. I think another thing he brings up is that whenever there was a battlefield killing, the soldier was pinged for it, who did it, but very rarely the investigation looked into why the command failings happened that allowed that soldier, or set the conditions that soldier did what he did.
Yeah. It was quite an impactful book. It definitely put a lot of stuff in context. And I think in the military we're very good at saying yes. You get to the top of the military tree by saying yes, which means that everyone at the top of the military is a yes man. And there's no one that says, actually, no, that's a really bad idea.
It's hard to say. And you're right, because if you say no, you're not seen as being willing to get the job done, despite of equipment shortages, shortage of manpower. You're not a team player. You won't. You're not somebody that will make things happen, and that can be corrosive. As you say.
And everyone wants the devil's advocate in the room to counter, but actually no one wants to be that person, because once you get that reputation, you're the one that's going to be you're the Lance Corporal forever.
Yeah.
And everyone else becomes the RSM or the Major or the Colonel.
And I think now in the risk-based resilience field that I work in now, like raising risks is part of the game, right? And a lot of people leave the military and go into these risk-based fields. But I don't think the military is very good at risk management itself, by the fact that we're sending people out in unarmored vehicles into high-threat IED areas. We're deploying, how many, I heard on your podcast last week about Northern Ireland. It took us 30 years and 20,000 troops continuously to be in a stabilising role in Northern Ireland. We sent 5,000 initially over to Afghanistan.
Was that Northern Ireland lesson? Soft hats on streets. Never mind all the other stuff about you need intelligence, you need strategic patience. No, stick a berry on and that will sort it out.
What has changed slightly for the military is, and I saw a lot of it because I was involved in some parts, was bringing more civilians into the command. So policy advisors, cultural advisors, intelligence as well, because they're not, although they work for the commander, they're not in the same chain of command and not impacted, and their view was different to the chain of command, and the commander would listen to them as well, because they were not.
But also, mate, I saw the other side of that. So I worked in the aerospace industry when I left, and I was running projects in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I often saw, depending who the commander was, and I was working with like majors and half colonels, and some of them would listen to you because you could see some of the other ones, the shutters coming down because you're a civvy. I agree with you. I think it depends on the person, who they listen to, who they will take advice from.
It definitely, and I think some of the brigadiers, they wanted that civilian from various different departments to provide a different view, and not the group think. It's maybe something slightly different. And I remember General Carter brought a load of academics into Afghanistan as part of a PRISM group to look at the problem and give a total different viewpoint. And then they could go away and they could consider it, but it broke the group thinking all the time, which was the 6-month war cycle.
Was it those advisors that gave Carter the idea that the Taliban were lovely country boys, just a wee bit misguided?
Ah, see. Anyway, let's move on to your favourite film.
Favourite film? I'm definitely a sucker for Terminator 2. I love that film. I watched all extras and saw how even back in the 90s, without that good special effects, that they got that truck to jump off the bridge with the two Terminators fighting on it. Yeah, that was just amazing. So yeah, I love that film. I think I'm quite drawn to those sort of pre and post-apocalyptic films.
Everybody loves a bit of Arnie. And what would your luxury item be, Rob?
I think, well, if it's on like a desert island or something, you got to have the old survival knife. That'll help you out.
Sure. I don't know if we should trust an officer with a knife, though, mate.
I know. Don't allow me to drive, especially not an HGV.
Or a compass and a map.
Oh, that was low. That's a low. We'll deal with him when he signs off, Rob. That's a bit of a low blow.
So, Colin, your book for this.
So I've done a couple of pods recently on the Far East and World War II, and Kev and I often talk about the Far East and World War II offline. And I'd never read it before, so my choice this week is Defeat into Victory by Field Marshal William Slim. It's quite a thick volume, but it's very easily readable for a senior officer. It's written so that, you know, a soldier can get a firm grip on it. And it's widely regarded as one of the finest military memoirs of the Second World War. And in it, he recounts his experience commanding the British 14th Army, which is made up of loads of Indian soldiers, soldiers from all over the place. And something I learned in that book, I didn't realise they even had Chinese soldiers attached to them. So it starts off with all the bitter defeats and the retreats at the hands of the Japanese, but ultimately it ends in one of the most remarkable turnarounds of the war. So Slim blends strategic insight, as I said before, with a soldier's eye for detail, explaining how he rebuilt morale, restructured logistics. They use a lot of air resupply, and he adapted the tactics to the harsh jungle environment that would also help beat the Japanese. So it's more than just a campaign history. It really reflects his leadership philosophy. He was practical, humane, and deeply focused on the welfare of his men. And I think that's a hallmark of all decent commanders. And from my own personal experience, I'm going to a piss up in a brewery, which hopefully the gunners can organise in a couple of weeks' time for my CO, who took us to Northern Ireland in the late 80s. And he's a man that fits all those leadership philosophies, practical, humane, and deeply focused on his welfare of his men. So when we had 2 guys killed in our troop and several others badly wounded, and I never found this out for years later, he flew out the relatives on his own money to visit them in the hospital in Belfast. Wow. There's going to be a really good turnout for this guy, and I don't think there's many CEOs 40 years later would have that affection from their blokes. So Slim was also like that from what I can gather from this book, and it's both a gripping narrative of jungle warfare and a timeless study in command. So Kev, what's yours?
Mine is it's part of the Restepio story that we've talked about the film before. It's a book by Sebastian Junger, who was one of the reporters. A book called War, and I've got the photographic book by Tim Hetherington, say it right. Hetherington, yes, him. So I've got his photographs, Sebastian's book about the war, about the valley, and I watched the DVD again recently, and it was a tough year, but to have 2 reporters embedded in, and they flew in and out, they weren't there all the time. What an amazing story, and they captured that platoon.
It's Watts and all as well. I'm surprised the American Army let some of it go out, because you see guys breaking down in tears, and it's not usually gung-ho image that the American force. It's Watts and all, isn't it, about war?
It's a proper embed, isn't it? Because they were experiencing it as well, and they were obviously getting as upset as because they formed relationships. And when they did the interviews after they all came back, you can see that they were marked. And when you look at the photographs, they have photographs of pre and post, and you can see they're aged and the stress. No, it's and I think it's something that it is raw. It's a really raw book. It's a raw video DVD, and really well put together. And I don't think you could do that again. I don't think many armies would let you do that again, because it did bring home to families, especially people that were injured and killed out there, the real story.
Yeah, I remember watching that. Very, very impactful. Yeah, it's,
probably the most I've seen of any of the documentaries that have been done. It was probably the most hardest hitting when you watch it, and it was gritty. Well, Rob, thank you very much for coming on this episode. And obviously, there is going to be a part 2 with Rob, as I mentioned, talk about Iraq and then post-military. But thank you, the listener, for coming and listening to this podcast. And thank you for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming. Do email Colin. Use the social media links. Give us ideas. Obviously, I still accept snail mail.
I'm going to give it your address one day, mate, and you'll get hate mail.
Yeah, it's up north. You'll find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you downloaded us from iTunes and liked the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review. A good review, obviously. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support through his company ISARR. So, for the next episode, see you on The Unconventional Soldier.